I'll go ahead and run the application. I'll go to the goat page. And notice that because the goat is the first animal in the hierarchy under the farm animals, it doesn't have a previous button, but it does have a next button. And the next button indicates that it goes to the llama, because that's the next sibling node in that level of the hierarchy. So I'll click on that. And now, because the llama is in the middle of the group of sibling nodes, it has both a previous and a next button. Previous button goes back to the goat. The next button goes to the pig. The pig is the next node in that hierarchy. This functionality in the page is implemented by using the Navigation API. As you're going to see in a moment in the code, it uses the static current node property of the system.web.sitemap object, which returns a sitemap node object. And then to get references to the sibling nodes, the code just calls the next sibling and previous sibling properties of the sitemap node object returned by the current node. So the bottom line is that the sitemap object has a number of objects that you can use in order to get information about your current location within the navigation hierarchy, as well as perform various other navigation tasks. The code is also going to extract information from the built-in and custom attributes of the current node to get the URL of the picture and to generate the message that appears below the picture indicating what kind of sound each animal makes. So let's take a look at the code. This is the code in the animal.aspx.vb code file. All of the action is happening in the page load event procedure. We start out by dimming up a couple of strings to hold the title and the description for the current node. In order to get that information, all we need to do is use the sitemap object and read the current node property. Once we have a reference to the current node, then it's just a matter of reading different properties to extract the information. That's how easy it is to read the attributes from the sitemap file. Don't need to do any kind of XML parsing or any other kind of work like that. So the title and description are standard attributes of the sitemap file. We also have a sound attribute as a custom attribute. In order to get access to that, the current node is available as a collection, and we can just pass in the name of the attribute as a string. And that extracts the value, and then we save it within the sound variable. The next thing we need to do is build up the images. So we have an animal image with an image URL. So what we've done to make it easy to read in those images is we have named the JPEG files the same text as in the title attribute for each of the nodes within the site hierarchy. That makes it really easy to build a string that retrieves the name of the file, and then all we need to do is set that URL string to the image URL property. You can also set the title property of the header object in order to display the title. And then we can also display the information at the bottom that indicates the name of the animal and the sound it makes by building up the string and just passing in the values of the string description and the string sound. The other thing the page does is has those buttons at the bottom. The way it does that is it checks to see whether or not the previous sibling property returns nothing or not. If it's not nothing, in other words, there is a previous sibling for the current node within the hierarchy, we set the leftmost button's visible property to true, and then we also set the tooltip to the description of that previous sibling. That's why I could hover over the button and it tells me exactly where I'm going to go. And then the last thing to do is set the navigate URL of the button to the URL of the previous sibling. And that's what enables the functionality that when the user clicks on that button, he or she is taken to that particular page. Otherwise, if previous sibling is nothing, then we just set the button's visible property to false and the navigate URL property to an empty string. We do pretty much the exact same process for the next button by using the next sibling property. If it's not nothing, we set up and enable the button. Otherwise, we disable the button. The sitemap class also exposes a root node property. By using that and the child nodes property of each sitemap node, you can write code that recursively creates a complete model of the sitemap tree. So this simple example shows just how robust the features are that you can use within the Navigation API in order to get information about exactly where the user is within the application. If the built-in navigation controls don't do what you need them to do, then it's relatively easy to build up your own kind of navigation infrastructure. And you don't have to start from scratch. So let's look at another example of this. The sitemap and related classes provide everything you need to create dynamic navigation for a website. In this next sample, the code behind the site's master page displays information about the sitemap provider as well as the current node. So I'll go ahead and run the application again. And this time I'll go to my favorite animal, the dog node, and scroll down. And notice that we have this checkbox here to display provider and site node information. I'll click on that to set it. The page posts back, and I'll scroll down and notice that now the page has a lot of information about the provider used to implement the sitemap, as well as information about the node itself. So as you can see, we're currently using the ASP.NET XML sitemap provider. It has a description of sitemap provider, which reads in .sitemap XML files. Security trimming is currently disabled. We'll talk a little bit more about security trimming a little bit later in this section. And then the lower part of the page displays information about the node, the title, description, the URL. The dog node has no child nodes, so that's set to false. The root node is home, parent node is pets, next sibling is rabbit, and the previous sibling is kitten. And this is just a subset of all of the information that you can get about the current node. So let's see how this is implemented in the code. I'll open up the code file behind the master page. Now the reason it's in the master page is that we want this functionality to be available on all pages throughout the website. Obviously, if we wanted it in just one page, we'd put that within that page file. But here we want it as part of the master page. When the page load event procedure fires, it runs the display info method. This is the method that takes care of checking to see whether or not the checkbox is checked or not, and then if it is, displaying the information. We also call the same method within the check changed event of that checkbox on the page, so that when the user checks or unchecks the checkbox, the method runs and displays or hides the information as necessary. So here's the method that does all that work. The first thing it does is check to see whether or not the checkbox is checked. And then it builds up a string provider that just reads all kinds of properties from the sitemap and its child properties in order to display the information. And it wraps it all up in some nice HTML to display with some bold text and some line breaks. So it's reading the name of the provider, the description of the provider, and then whether or not security trimming is currently enabled. So that's the information that it displays about the provider. The next section of code gets information about the current node. To make the code a little bit easier to read, it first declares a node object that is of type sitemapNode and stores a reference to the current node within that object. And then similar process. Declares a string and just reads various properties and wraps it all up in nice HTML. The next section of code displays information about the parent node. Now the parent node may be nothing if this particular current node is at the top of the hierarchy. In other words, if we were running this code on the home page, the parent node property would be nothing. So we check to see whether it's nothing or not. If it's not nothing, then we go ahead and add the name of the parent node to that string of the node information. Otherwise, we add none to it. And we do the same thing for the next sibling. We have to check to see whether or not it's nothing, because there may not be a next sibling, and similar process. Same process for the previous sibling, and then we finish up by assigning those strings to the inner HTML property of a couple of div elements on the page. And we finish up by displaying the information, setting the visible property to true. The div provider object wraps up the other two div elements. Otherwise, if the checkbox is unchecked, we just set div provider's visible property to false, and the information is not displayed. You won't often need or want to display navigation information like this, but you may have a need to get access to this kind of information in order to customize the page and the navigation structure. So it's great that the API makes all of those features available. URL mapping is another navigation feature of ASP.NET. You'd use that to modify, usually simplify, site URLs. You can actually change the URLs that the user sees in the browser, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to a physical page that you have within your site. One of the important uses for this is for search engine optimization. A lot of search engines won't index pages that use query strings. That's changing and improving a little bit, but you can make your site a lot more search engine friendly by modifying the URLs that appear. So the way this works is that you could change from example.com/animal.aspx $animal = kitten, where you have an animal query string, and you could change it to example.com/animal/kitten.aspx. And what's really pretty amazing about this is that you don't even have to have a physical kitten.aspx page. ASP.NET takes care of translating that second URL into the first one, because your physical site on the server actually has just a single animal.aspx page that uses query strings in order to display different animals. In previous versions of ASP.NET, you had to write your own URL rewriting code, and that was really kind of a messy thing. ASP.NET has a lot of support for doing that sort of thing, but it was a little bit tricky to get right. But now it's actually built into ASP.NET, and it's quite simple. So let's see how this works. Here's the web.config file for the navigation sample application. This is the URL mappings element. What this is doing is this is defining the actual physical URLs that the site uses, in this case the animal.aspx with a query string with animal = kitten. So that's the physical URL that is mapped to the animals kitten.aspx. There is no animal subdirectory off the root folder of this application, nor is there a kitten.aspx file. It just doesn't exist within the application. So when the browser requests the kitten.aspx file, ASP.NET takes care of mapping that to the actual file that it needs to open and send down, animal.aspx. Now, in order to actually make this work, I need to set the enabled property to true. I'll go ahead and do that, and save the web.config file. Now, this section uses the familiar pattern of configuration files within the .NET framework of having an add element. You can also have remove and clear elements as well, so that if you have a hierarchy of web.config files in subfolders, you have very fine-grained control over which URLs are mapped for pages within each subfolder. URL mappings is one area where you may want to consider using external configuration files. We cover configuration files in a lot more detail in other parts of the course, but I want to mention this so that you understand that this is a nice way of keeping track of the various mappings that you use. Because much of your work creating ASP.NET applications involves modifying configuration settings in order to implement features and customize how they behave. Besides putting all of the configuration data in the main web.config file, you can also move configuration settings into external files. You can kind of think of these external files as include files for configuration. So using external files has several benefits. One is that it aids maintenance. It just makes it a lot easier to maintain various files. Rather than having a huge monolithic web.config file, you can break it up, and it just makes it easier to keep track of everything. A big benefit for web applications is that changes to external configuration files, by default, don't cause an application restart. If you make a change to your web.config, by default ASP.NET will restart the application because it detects that you've made some sort of a configuration change. This can wreak havoc with your application. If users are in the middle of doing something, they would lose all of their session information, for example. Now you can modify that, so you have a lot of flexibility in what changes causes application restarts or don't cause them. Now moving URL mappings to an external configuration file lets you maintain the mappings without concern about resetting the application. So if you add any pages to the application or you make changes to the sitemap, you don't necessarily want the entire application to restart. So in order to implement this, you would point to an external configuration section by setting the config source attribute of the URL mappings to a different config file. Now, instead of including the actual mappings within the web.config, ASP.NET is going to go, in this case, to the URL mappings.config file to read those different settings. And then you can also specify whether or not to restart the application on changes. You need to make this change to the section attribute within the root web.config file. That's the master web.config file that's located along with the .NET Framework files, along with machine.config. So this is a handy technique for really keeping control of your URL mappings. Now, in order to get URL mappings to work, you also need to change the URLs in the sitemap file to use the friendly URLs. Because as you navigate around the site, those URLs in the sitemap file are the actual URLs that the browser is going to request from the website. When they request a mapped URL, ASP.NET translates that into an actual physical file and sends that file back down to the browser. So this is the mechanism for linking the real and friendly URLs. Now, another way of doing this is that you can simply edit the URL attribute setting in the old sitemap. Instead, what we're going to do in this sample, we'll take the opportunity to demonstrate another technique, the use of child sitemaps. Here's the web.sitemap file that we've been using for this navigation sample application. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this code here and comment out the lower section. So what this is doing is this is specifying a sitemap node, just like every other node within this file. But instead of having child nodes that define the navigation hierarchy, I'm now including this other sitemap file called URL mappings. That can be called anything I want. That's a custom name. So let's take a look at that file. I'll first go ahead and save that and open up that other file. So notice what this file is doing is it itself is a full sitemap file. So we actually have a sitemap node. Then it consists of child sitemap node elements that contain various URLs. So in this case, we're using the pets.aspx, so that's just a physical page within the application. Then its child nodes have the URLs mapped. So in this first example, we have a URL that the user is going to see of animals/kitten.aspx that has a title of kitten. And then we have a sitemap node of animals.dog.aspx and animals.rabbit.aspx. So these are the actual URLs that are going to appear in the browser when the user sees it. When the user requests a page such as kitten.aspx, the URL mappings within the web.config file kick in, and the ASP.NET application knows what physical file to serve up to the user. All right, everything's set up, so I'll go ahead and run the application again. Now when I go to the kitten page, notice that we have the mapped URL. We have no animal subdirectory, we have no kitten.aspx, Nevertheless, we can navigate to that particular page because the URL is mapped. Keep in mind that this particular example demonstrates two different techniques. We combine things a little bit. The use of URL mapping as well as using child sitemap files. But you don't always have to use the two techniques together. You can implement URL mappings without using a child sitemap file. Simply adjust the URLs in the main sitemap file to reflect the friendly URLs defined in the URL mappings. The word provider is used with navigation sitemaps in a way that might seem a little bit confusing. Consider these valid settings in a web.config file. The Map1 and Map2 providers both use the same method of retrieving sitemap nodes from an XML file. It uses the XML sitemap provider. The only difference is that they work with two different sitemap files, Map1 sitemap and Map2 sitemap. The default provider always gets its data from a file named web.sitemap. So that can be a little bit confusing because all three of these providers use the same class, which is also named XML sitemap provider. But using this example web.config setting, you could set the sitemap provider property of a control to either Map1 or Map2 to make use of alternative sitemap XML files used, as you can see above, the map1.sitemap or map2.sitemap. If you leave the sitemap provider property of a control blank, the control expects to find a sitemap named web.sitemap. You can also reference a child sitemap in sitemap node element by referring to a provider that is defined in web.config. This has the same effect as using a sitemap file attribute to point to a child sitemap file, except that the file location is retrieved from a provider definition. So there I'm specifying that map2 provider, and that's going to use that map2 sitemap. So the term provider isn't really used as you might expect, nor is it used in the same way in other features of ASP.NET. So multiple different sitemap providers can all use the same XML sitemap provider, but can point to different sitemap files. So for example, Map2 could be configured to point to a custom class that gets sitemap nodes from a database rather than an XML file. You have a lot of flexibility in how you put all this together. So in this context, think of the provider being the source of the navigation information, here the sitemap files.